Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon to join us on our webinar today. We're going to really just go over the basics of the administrative review process. We aren't going to go into a lot of nitty-gritty detail. We just wanted to give folks sort of an overview of the timeline and what to expect for both the off-site portions and the on-site portion of the administrative review. So just a few quick housekeeping items. All of you are currently in listen-only mode. If you have a question, go ahead and use the raise your hand function through the GoToWebinar software. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end. And we also want to let everybody know that the webinar is being recorded, but we'll stop recording before the Q&A session. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you if you have a question. You can also always type a question into the question box through the GoToWebinar toolbar. So to briefly go over our outline for today, we're going to start by talking about the annual process to select who we review and also the schedule. We'll talk about the off-site portion. We'll talk about the on-site portion and the timeframes for that. And then we'll also briefly go over the activities for the post-review. So first, to just briefly talk about who's getting reviewed in the current school year. For school districts over the current school year, that'll be Nye County, Story County, Eureka, Lincoln, Pyramid Lake, Duckwater, Humboldt, Eureka, and Esmeralda. For RCCIs, we'll be reviewing St. Jude's Ranch, Caliente Youth Training Center, Northern Nevada Child and Adolescent Services, and Washoe County Department of Juvenile Services. So these are all the SFAs that are in year 2 of the cycle. So occasionally we get questions from folks on why they were selected for a review. So to talk about some basics, every year approximately 11 school food authorities are reviewed. In this current school year, as was the same for last school year, we first were primarily charged with reviewing districts who are not yet certified for the additional 6 cents per meal. So those folks that in this current school year are not yet certified have sort of been put to the top of the list for those getting reviewed. We've also added on districts that haven't been reviewed in the past 4 or 5 years. Previously, we were on a 5-year cycle, but going forward, starting with last school year, every SFA will be reviewed at least every 3 years. So we went from a 5-year cycle and shrunk it down to a 3-year cycle, and that was due to a federal mandate. Okay, now we're going to talk about the off-site portion of the review. So you also might have heard this referred to as the pre-review portion. So 68 weeks prior to the start of the on-site portion of the admin review, you're going to receive an official notification letter. And that admin review notification letter is going to tell you the dates of the review. It's going to list some information that must be sent prior to the start of the review. And then it's also going to list information that needs to be gathered so that we can have access to that once we start the on-site portion of the review. In addition to that initial letter, 4 to 6 weeks prior to the start of the on-site portion, we will need to set up an appointment with you to complete a couple of documents. And the body of the email will likely suggest a time for setting up that appointment. but we're flexible on that. So if the time we give doesn't work for you, let us know and we can set up something that works. However, we do have to complete certain portions of it 4 weeks prior to the start of the on-site review. So just keep that in mind that we still need that 4-week lead time. And during this appointment, we're going to complete a couple of documents. The first is going to be a resource management risk assessment tool. This tool we'll talk a little bit more in depth on the next slide in terms of what it'll cover, but the outcome of those questions will determine if a comprehensive resource management review will need to be completed. We'll also be completing what we call the off-site assessment tool, and this is a series of questions that covers all basic areas of the program. So everything from counting and claiming, how benefit issuance is handled, to questions about the menu. We'll also be either asking you to complete or completing with you a dietary specification risk assessment tool. So depending on the number of sites, we'll need to complete a form that'll tell us which site to focus in on. And once we determine that site, then we'll go through this dietary specification risk assessment tool. And that's going to ask questions really that relate to meal planning and production. So it'll ask about things like salt shakers, food preparation methods in terms of deep frying, and the outcome of that risk assessment tool will determine how we what steps we take when we do the nutrient analysis portion. So you may need to gather different staff members to help answer some of these questions, depending on the size of the SFA. If you only have one site and you have a very small staff, then that'll be a pretty streamlined series of questions. If you're a big SFA with a lot of sites and a lot of staff involved with the management of the program, you may need to bring in someone who can answer questions specific about fiscal. You may need to bring in somebody who can answer questions specific about menus and meal production. Okay, it looks like we may have a technical issue with the slides not showing, so I'm just going to try to address that real quick if everyone could just hang on for a little bit. Okay, hopefully we've got that sorted out and everyone can see the slides as they change. Okay, so we left off talking about the offsite portion of the review and the information we'll need to gather from you then. Okay, so to talk a little more in depth about that resource management risk assessment tool, it's going to cover areas that really relate to the financial administration of the program. So the first thing we'll need to look at is your paid lunch equity spreadsheet, and we'll be asking some questions about that. We'll also be asking questions about the nonprofit food service account in terms of whether you operate in the black, turning a profit, or if you run at a deficit. We'll ask some questions about how you calculate your revenue from non-program foods. So those will be things like a la carte sales or adult meals. We'll be asking about indirect costs, if those are charged to the program and what indirect rates used. And then we'll also have a question about USDA foods. So to continue to talk about the offsite portion, once you receive the letter, and this information will be included in the letter, there will be a couple of pieces of information that we'll need from you as soon as possible. The first is a list of schools in the district, the grades at each school, and what menu each school follows. We'll need a copy of each menu type used. If you've already been certified, we'll need a copy of your completed menu certification worksheets for each menu type. We'll need a completed paid lunch equity tool and a non-program food revenue tool, if those are applicable. And other information may be requested depending on the result of that offsite assessment tool and the questions we ask there. So we might be asking you to send us copies of policies, possibly a blank copy of your meal benefit application, your public release, but we'll let you know and follow up through email what information we'll need you to send us. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and talk about the on-site portion of the admin review. So really the basic timeline is that we'll start with an introductory conference, and we'll talk about these items more in depth on the following slides. Then we'll actually do the on-site portion of the administrative review, where we observe meals and review your documentation. At the completion of the on-site portion, we'll conduct an exit conference. And the duration of the review, or the number of days we'll spend on-site, will depend on the number of sites you have in your SFA, the documents that we're able to review prior to the review, and also the orderliness of the documents gathered for the review will have a big impact on the length of time. If documents are already prepared and have been gathered in a very orderly fashion, that'll really streamline the amount of time we need to spend on site. So to talk about the introductory conference in a little more detail, it'll provide an opportunity to introduce staff, both from our group and also the School Food Authority staff. We'll explain the scope of the review. We'll also determine which sites meals will be observed at. And we'll also conduct any technical assistance that was identified as needed during the off-site review assessment portion. So during the on-site portion, we'll need you to provide a working area for the NDA review staff. And this working area ideally needs to be near an electrical outlet. We work largely with laptops, so we'll need to be able to plug those in. And having the required documentation gathered and well organized will really streamline the amount of time we spend on site. So we strongly encourage you to gather that documentation as soon as possible and have it organized in an orderly fashion. And this documentation may need to come from different departments or staff depending on the size of your SFA, but we'll need access to meal benefit applications, claim backup, and also your nutrition information, so your food labels, your recipes, and we'll also, when we're on site, take a look at food storage areas. Okay, so when we're on site, we'll be observing meals at a certain number of sites, and that number of sites is based on your total number of sites. So we won't be going to every single site in your SFA unless you only have one site, and then of course we'll be going to that one site. We'll also be reviewing that requested documentation. So we'll be looking at student applications, meal counting and claiming backup. We'll be looking at compliance with the meal pattern. So we'll be checking to make sure the nutritional requirements are met. And we also will be looking at other areas depending on the amount of documentation we can get beforehand. We'll also be interviewing staff on current practices. And really the goal of the on-site portion is to assess compliance with USDA regulations. Once the on-site portion is complete and we've observed the meals at sites, we'll conduct an exit conference. And in that exit conference, we'll provide the initial information from the on-site review. So we'll let you know any major observations. We'll set up any technical assistance that might be needed to correct items. We'll also be discussing what corrective actions will be requested. We'll also discuss with you what possible timeframes are appropriate for those corrective actions. Some things may be able to be corrected while we're there, but some items may take more time to fully correct them. So we'll be chatting with you on what an appropriate course of action will be. Okay, so this brings the next question of what if things are out of compliance? So some areas of non-compliance do require fiscal action, and this is generally incorrect applications, incomplete or absent documentation, or incorrect meal counts. And those items are mandated by USDA for us to take fiscal action in certain situations. However, other areas of non-compliance could result in your 6 cents being turned off if you've already been certified. So those would be items, typically those are related to meal pattern. Some repeat violations may result in fiscal action if seen in any area. So this could be related to meal pattern, it could be related to production records, it could relate to benefit issuance. In some items, you'll be able to just fix on site, we'll document that, and that's all the action that'll be needed. So the range of outcomes, depending on what is out of compliance, could be just you fixing those on site and documenting that you fixed them, to fiscal action depending on the severity of the issue. Okay, so now to go over what steps will need to be taken post-review. So the Nevada Department of Agriculture will send a letter notifying you of review findings, if there are any, and we'll also be requesting a corrective action plan that corresponds with those findings. So we'll be telling you the issues that we saw when we were there, and we'll be asking you to let us know how you'll be fixing those, and we call that a corrective action plan. So once you get that review letter with those findings, you'll be working on a corrective action plan. And hopefully these are things that you've already been working on based on what we talked about at the exit conference. You'll compile those into a letter and send those to us. You may need to include documentation to show compliance with any of the findings we've identified. And if that corrective action is satisfactory, then we'll send a closure letter. If needed, we may be doing follow-up reviews on site to ensure that all those corrective action items were put into place. So this corrective action plan we've talked about documents any findings and how they'll be addressed. You may need to submit follow-up items as well, as I've mentioned, so that could be an updated manual, revised recipes if there were issues in those areas. And if your corrective action is not submitted by the deadline, or if it's not satisfactory, there's potential for your payment to be held. So we want to make sure folks are clear on what needs to be included in that corrective action plan and to turn it in a timely fashion. So this closure letter, when you receive that, that officially ends the administrative review, and you should receive that within 30 days of a completed corrective action plan. Okay, now we have plenty of time to answer any questions you may have, and you can type those into the question box, and we already have one question, so that's great. I'll go ahead and address that, and then if anybody has any questions, raise your hand or type your question into the question box. So the first one we'll start with is from Angelica Hernandez. And the question is, can we have a copy of the PowerPoints you're using? The answer is yes. We'll be sending those out as soon as the webinar is over. Since we